Yes, thank you. So, is the president? Is the president is Sheila Katz?
Grüezi miteinander. My last words in German today. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, on behalf of the Swiss Federation of Jewish Communities, SEG, I have the great pleasure to introduce to you today my esteemed friend, Ambassador Stuart E. Eizenstat. Dear Stuart, I feel very deeply honored and privileged by your presence and welcome you warmly together with your partner, Marion. We live in chaotic times, in times of total uncertainty, but also in times of an unprecedented complexity. Politicians in many countries respond to this complexity with simple and populistic messages, and are successful in catching votes. All over the world, populistic and nationalistic parties achieve a dramatic gain of votes in elections and ballots. Last but not least, and particularly so in Europe. These parties have all one common issues: the fear of globalization, the rejection of immigration and minorities in general, the skepticism against the institutions, the distrust against the establishment. In contrast, they all hold in high esteem their own people and their own nation. We live in times in which the hostile atmosphere has become worse worldwide. Also because even high-ranking politicians make use of conspiracy theories, playing with anti-Semitic and racist stereotypes. What's going on? I'm asking myself. It is increasingly difficult to keep track of all of it and to measure up in which direction our world will go. The compass, which used to give us the necessary orientation, seems to no more guide us in the right direction. Uneasiness and insecurity are spreading. With Stuart Eizenstat, we today have a personality among us who has lived through 40 years of political history at very close range. But not only that, in his various highest level functions and positions, he played a key role in politics. Born in Chicago in 1943, Stuart Eizenstat can look back at a varied career. After completing his law studies at Harvard Law School, he worked as a policy advisor to the Presidents Johnson and Carter, represented the USA as their ambassador to the EU in Brussels, and was the Deputy Treasury Secretary under President Clinton. Later, former US Secretary of State John Kerry mandated him as a special envoy for Holocaust issues. Today, he runs the international division of Covington Burlingham, one of the most prominent US law firms. In Switzerland, of course, Stuart Eizenstat is not an unknown person. In the second half of the 90s, he was a dominating figure on the Swiss political stage. In the controversy over Switzerland's actions and failures at the time of the Nazis, the American top-level diplomat was one of the most prominent critics of our country. His mission was to clarify the whereabouts of the gold looted by the Nazis and sitting in Swiss bank accounts, and to push for the restitution of bank accounts to heirs of Jews who once had owned them, but perished under the Nazis, so that these accounts became dormant. On May 7, 1997, you may remember the American authorities published the famous so-called Eizenstat report on the Swiss financial transactions during the Nazi regime. Stuart Eizenstat is also considered as one of the architect, or as the architect really, of the so-called Washington Principles. In December 1998, 44 states committed to investigate in their museums and restitute to the rightful owners or their heirs art that had been stolen mainly from Jewish owners in the German Reich and the occupied countries. The Washington Declaration that was promulgated at that time affected and still affects quite a lot today. It greatly influences the way museums today handle their collections. As an example, the Declaration played a central role in the Kunstmuseum's barren acceptance of the Gurlitt collection. Till date, Stuart continues to be strongly engaged in the fight for the discovery of looted art and their restitution. Such a commitment is more relevant than ever, as only a fraction of the estimated 600,000 stolen objects have so far been restituted. But also as an author, Stuart Eizenstat has achieved great success and publicity. With President Carter, the White House years, published last year a highly acclaimed book on Jimmy Carter's presidency, during which he played such an important role. And last, but certainly not least, Stuart Eizenstat has proven to be an unremitting fighter and advocate for the Jewish cause and Israel. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we live in insecure times. I even said chaotic times. Times in which you're grateful for someone to take us by the hand and to give us some guidance through the chaos. Thus, we today have the unique opportunity to hear from Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat how to read and understand our times. And perhaps we will even learn how we can master this chaos, at least partially. I'm sure that we will get a few answers to the most urgent questions already from his speech entitled A Panoramic View of World Events Impacting the United States, Israel, and the Jewish People. In the subsequent talk with Roger Schawinski, certainly further aspects touching this subject of his speech will be discussed. I'm sure I do not have to present Roger Schawinski anymore to this audience. We have today with Roger one of the most prominent and distinguished journalists of this country, author of books and media entrepreneur of the first hour of this country, well known and acclaimed also internationally. And now, I wish you all an interesting afternoon. Stuart, may I ask you?
Thank you very much, Herbert. I'm really very touched by your introduction. On behalf of the Swiss Federation, I want to recognize also, because I'm in the building of the Community Center of the ICZ, Michelle Kurtzis, president of the community, many distinguished leaders and friends. I always feel at home when I come to Switzerland. I've spent a great deal of time here. I'm on my way to Davos for my 24th straight year. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to address you here. I want to especially recognize my partner, Marianne Lewin, who is a healthcare specialist, but among other things, is the youngest surviving Holocaust twin and was involved on October 9th in Lucerne in a very moving ceremony honoring a Polish diplomat who served in the Polish government in exile in Bern and who was just discovered was helpful in forging several hundred Paraguayan passports, which enabled Marianne and her family, when they were deported from Westerbork, to go to Bergen-Belsen rather than to Auschwitz. So it's a very special pleasure to be here. I'm deeply grateful also that books have been made available for my newest book, President Carter, the White House Years, which I will not discuss at all in detail today. They're not enough to go around, but you can get them on Amazon, and if we get your addresses, I'll send a book plate autograph, which you can send. In the interest of time, I won't discuss the book at all, except to say this. I believe, having served at President Carter's right hand as his chief domestic advisor in the White House for 4 years, that he was the most consequential and accomplished one-term president in American history, and of particular importance to those of us in the Jewish community worldwide. It was Carter who negotiated the famous Camp David Accords and the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, which created the first peace between Israel and its most powerful Arab neighbor. He broke the back of the Arab boycott of Israel. He championed the cause of Soviet Jewry, first disclosed in this book. He helped save, along with me, 50,000 Iranian Jews from the clutches of the Iranian Revolution, and is the father of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which now remarkably has had more than 50 million visitors, 3/4 of whom are non-Jewish. Now, I want to touch on two major things in my talk. First, just a piece about President Trump, and particularly his orientation to Israel, and then to talk about challenges facing the Jewish world. President Trump is a transformative and, by his own terms, disruptive president. He's transformed the Republican Party in his own image. He's transformed the presidency and its relationship to the approach to key institutions, including the courts and the Justice Department. He has been a model for the populist nationalist revolution, which has swept Europe and even now Latin America and Brazil. He's withdrawn the United States historically from a number of major international agreements which were reached by his predecessors. And no more is his dramatic and disruptive impact shown than in the Middle East. And let me talk briefly about that. It has been U.S. policy since the formation of the Jewish state under Republican and Democratic presidents to be strongly supportive of the state of Israel. No other country other than the United States has been as steadfast in its loyalty to Israel. We provide today $3 billion in economic assistance to the state of Israel, and before that in military and economic assistance as well. What's distinctive about President Trump's approach is that all American presidents, as supportive as they have been of Israel, has also recognized the need to try to resolve the Palestinian issue by earning the trust of both sides. And that, I think, is one thing that unfortunately has been lost. I supported and do support the movement of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. It's long since the case that it should have been done. Jerusalem is Israel's capital. We put our embassy in any country, 190 countries around the world, in what they consider their capital. But in so doing, it would have been very important to show trust on the Palestinian side as well, and to advance the peace process, to indicate that he supported a two-state solution, which was not said, that he looked forward to having the U.S. Embassy in East Jerusalem when there was a peace agreement, and instead, all economic assistance to the Palestinian Authority has been cut off. This will hardly encourage them to enter into negotiations with Israel. At the same time, and to his credit, he has forged strong relationships, building on that of his predecessors, with the predominantly Sunni states, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Egypt, and Jordan, in particular in an alliance against Iran, which is Israel's greatest existential threat. Perhaps we can get into that more in the question period. The American people are justifiably tired about America's involvement in wars in the Middle East. The war in Afghanistan has gone on now for 17 years. It's the longest standing war in American history, more than World War I and World War II put together, and still inconclusive. But in making the decision without full consultation with his own advisors to cut the American troop presence in half, it will, instead of leading to peace negotiations with the Taliban, help make it less likely that there will be one. And of more particular interest to Israel, the snap decision which caused the resignation of his most respected member of his cabinet, the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, to cut all troops from the United States out of Syria, and to do so precipitously, will create a vacuum into which Iran and Russia will fill, to the great danger of Israel. It will embolden the Iranians, who are already trying to build a permanent military facility with missile capability in Syria, which is absolutely unacceptable to Israel, and we won't have any troop presence there to help balance off the presence of Iran and Russia. It also leaves our chief allies, the Syrian Kurds, in great danger. Now let me talk more broadly about the Holocaust and the challenges we face as world Jews. And I say we because it's not Swiss Jews or American Jews or French Jews, it's we as a Jewish community. We've long since learned that we're all in this together. We've never fully recovered from the Holocaust, which took 2/3 of all of European Jewry. 2/3 of all of European Jewry. The flower of what had been Jewish religion, culture, and business. In 1939, before the outbreak of the war on September 1, when the Nazis invaded Poland, there were 17 million Jews worldwide and a world population of 2 billion. Today, 70 years later, there are only 14.5 million Jews in a world of 7 billion. And it's not simply numbers. The rabbis no longer able to interpret a tractate of the Talmud, cantors no longer able to sing, artists no longer able to paint, authors no longer able to write, simple people in shtetls no longer able to eke out a living, and 1.5 million young people who never had the chance to make their mark in the world. It's virtually unreplaceable. How do we honor those who were killed and those 400,000, yes, 400,000, who still survive? The first is to do everything possible to make certain that in their declining years, those who suffered so grievously in their youth live out their last lives and last years in dignity. And yet, of those 400,000 Holocaust survivors, over 80% in Central and Eastern Europe, 30% in the state of Israel, and 25% in the United States live in or near the poverty line. An absolutely unacceptable situation. Now, frankly, the German government has done its part, and I think I've negotiated more hours and days with them than perhaps any other person. They have contributed since the end of World War II over $60 billion to survivors. During the Clinton administration, among my other positions, I was special representative of President Clinton and Secretary of State Albright on Holocaust issues, and we negotiated on behalf of Holocaust survivors over $8 billion in recoveries from Germany, Austria, Swiss banks. The French banks have gotten tens of thousands of looted art pieces returned, paid insurance policies that weren't paid by European insurers because they said after the war that the beneficiaries of those who died in the camps didn't pay their premiums. Imagine. And we've returned thousands of synagogues and community centers and day schools and even cemeteries, which were confiscated by the Nazis and then nationalized by the communists, so that the re-emerging tiny, although they are, Jewish communities in the former Soviet Union and Central Europe would have the physical infrastructure to rebuild their lives. Since 2009, I've had the privilege of leading the negotiating team of the Jewish Claims Conference in our annual negotiations with the German government. And we've obtained, since 2009, in the last 10 years, $9 billion from Germany in the form of home care workers who help prepare medicines and food and transportation to doctors for survivors, and increased pensions and child survivor payments. And we just announced 2 months ago, and I'm saying it now because maybe one or more of you would qualify, and that is those who are on kinder transports will get a one-time payment this year. The Holocaust was not only the greatest genocide in history, it was the greatest theft of property in history. As Herbert mentioned, 600,000 pieces of art, millions of books, furniture, musical instruments, businesses, and homes. And what we've tried to do as best we can is to fill that gap. One of the ways was in 1998, the Washington Principles on Nazi looted art, the essence of which, of the 11 principles, was public museums in Europe and in the United States should research their collections. Anything between 1933 and 1945, which passed through European hands, should get a special look. If there's a gap in ownership, it should be published on the internet. And commissions should be set up, and they now have been set up in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Austria, and in the Netherlands to resolve these claims. But frankly, although over 40 countries, including all the European countries, signed on to the Washington Principles, many have forgotten them. Provenance research of collections has not been given a priority. In many countries, public museums haven't done it at all. The Swiss federal law on international transfers of cultural property is a model. It bans dealers and auctioneers from entering into transactions with art if they have any doubt of the provenance of that art. But it's unclear if the law will be specifically applied to Nazi looted art, and there's yet no commission to resolve claims. Swiss public museums don't appear to have thoroughly, if at all, reviewed the provenance of their collections in accordance with the Washington Principles. But on the positive side, the Kunstmuseum in Bern, to its credit, refused to take over 100 paintings out of the famous Gurlitt collection, many of which were looted by his father, and have said that they will not put any into the museum until the special German commission we helped organize to go through the Gurlitt collection does so according to the Washington Principles. The second imperative, to honor those who died in the Holocaust and those who survived, is to perpetuate memory. Money should not be the bottom line of Holocaust survival. How do we keep memory alive as the years pass and we lose 6% of survivors on average each year? For a combination of reasons which I go into in another book I wrote called Imperfect Justice, the Holocaust was not a major priority after World War II. It took decades before Holocaust memory occurred. Many survivors didn't want to share their stories with their children. They didn't want the pain to be transferred. They wanted to look to the future. But something as monstrous as the Holocaust in the end couldn't go into the mists of history. And once the Cold War was over, energies could be released to look backward and to learn lessons. Education is the key to memory. And that's why in 1978, I wrote a memorandum to President Carter urging the creation in Washington, D.C., our capital, of a commission headed by Elie Wiesel to recommend a suitable memorial to Holocaust victims. And that became the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I wish you could simply stand outside the doors of that museum for 1 hour and see school children come in from all over the country, see cadets from our military academies coming in for learning and tolerance lessons about it, seeing police forces come in to learn. It's a beautiful thing to see. Education is the key. It's the key to refute Holocaust deniers. It's the key to expose for future generations the full dimensions of anti-Semitism. The Holocaust didn't come out of thin air. As Herbert and Anita were taking us around old Zürich, it's just a part of the history. 1349, when the Jews of 1949, were expelled from Zürich. And this happened all throughout Europe. We want to look back in education, to look forward, to learn the lessons of what happens when intolerance goes unchecked, when genocides around the world are ignored, whether it's in Africa or anywhere else. Education is the key to prevent future genocides. In January of 2000, I had the privilege of representing President Clinton in Stockholm, Sweden, where we launched with the Prime Minister of Sweden, Gerson Persson, the Holocaust Education Task Force, then with only 6 countries, now with 31, to promote Holocaust education in the schools. And I'm very proud to say here in Zurich that in the last 6-month period, the rotating presidency of that Holocaust Education Task Force was Switzerland's, and Switzerland did a fantastic job of promoting exhibits all over the country, here and all over Europe. And Anita Winter had an exhibit in Washington and at the UN and elsewhere called The Faces of Swiss Holocaust Survivors. All of this is critically important so we don't let memory pass. A third way to honor the memory of those who were killed and those who survived is to combat the rising tide of contemporary anti-Semitism and the effort more recently to delegitimize the state of Israel as a state of the Jewish people. I want to be frank with you, I never until recently thought that modern day anti-Semitism was a first priority challenge. I do now. We've all grown too accustomed to, in large parts of the Muslim world, see Israel not even shown on a map, of children's books from Malaysia to Saudi Arabia, and yes, to the Palestinian Authority, in which Jews are portrayed in the most negative ways. If you saw it, it would turn your stomach. I'm talking about today, 2019. Official websites and television programs filled with vile descriptions as Jews as, quote, barbaric monkeys, wretched pigs, and murderers of Muhammad. But it's painfully clear that the revival of modern-day anti-Semitism is not simply an Islamic issue, and I want to make it clear that I have spent enormous amounts of time in government in the Muslim world. It was part of my mandate. The overwhelming majority of Muslims want peace. They want prosperity for their children. They don't want this. It's the more radical elements that I'm talking about. But let's look more broadly at what's happening now in Europe. The growing nationalist, populist movements in Europe have led to a resurgence of neo-Nazi parties in this continent, this blood-stained continent, employing traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes and xenophobia. And they've risen from the sewers into the parliaments in Greece, the Golden Dawn Party, Hungary, the Jobbik Party, the Svoboda Party in the Ukraine, the National Front in France, and most recently, the Alternative for Germany, which is now the main opposition party in the Bundestag, and one of whose leaders said 3 weeks ago, not 30 years ago, not 3 years ago, 3 weeks ago, that the Holocaust was simply a speck on 1,000 years of German history. In Toulouse, France, a day school killed a rabbi and 3 children were killed. The Jewish community in Hungary was targeted. In Malmo, Sweden, a series of attacks culminated in the bombing of the Jewish community center there. Our own Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh was the source of an anti-Semitic incident just a few months ago. The sources of anti-Semitism in Europe have come from a witch's brew of Muslim extremists. Again, I don't want to indict in any way the majority of the Muslim community, and the far left and far right. A study just published last month, December 2018, it was the largest survey ever done of the Jews of Europe. Almost 13,000 Jews in 12 countries of the European Union were surveyed by the European Union itself, by one of their own institutions. And it showed that almost a third of those Jews surveyed, who presumably stand for others, say they avoid Jewish events or venues out of fear for their safety. A similar percentage say within the last 5 years, they've considered emigrating. In France in 2015, over 10,000 French Jews went to Israel. The former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, has said very recently that the head of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, is, and I quote him, an existential threat. He's called Hamas and Hezbollah his friends. In Sweden, anti-Semitic harassment by far-right activists led for the first time since the end of World War II to the literal shutting of Jewish community in a town called Umeå. In late December 2018, just weeks ago, the European Council, representing the heads of all 28 countries, issued a declaration, thankfully, against anti-Semitism, calling on member states to shoulder the cost of security borne by Jewish communities and urging coordinated action against anti-Semitism. This effort is being played against a very broad landscape. Campuses in the United States, social media, international courts, the United Nations, all in a fight for world opinion. Now, frankly, neither Israel nor its supporters, Jewish and non-Jewish, were initially and adequately prepared for something called the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, aimed at discouraging business investment tourism, and academic exchanges with Israel. It began in many ways in 2001 with the UN-sponsored Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, which was quickly transformed into a conference, instead of combating racism worldwide, turning it into attack on Israel and saying that Zionism and racism were one and the same. The International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion declaring the Israeli defense wall illegal under international law. Belgium and the United Kingdom both have war crimes laws with universal jurisdiction that prevented senior Israeli officials from visiting there during the Lebanon and Gaza wars. The United Nations Human Rights Council singles out Israel more than any other country, indeed more than any other countries combined, for resolutions when you've got serial human rights violators like Zimbabwe and North Korea and Iran and the Congo. And insidiously, this very year, 2019, they will release a list of over 100 companies who do business in whole or in part in the West Bank, urging that they be boycotted. UK universities have a virtual boycott on academic exchanges. Just ask an Israeli academic the last time he was invited to speak at a UK university, or vice versa. Labeling requirements have been put on by the European Union on products made in the West Bank. Israel has been the largest non-European Union recipient of the European Union's massive grant program to promote high-tech and scientific research. It's actually third only to 2 other member states. And they had to sign an agreement that no recipient and no Israeli university could have any relationship with the West Bank if they were to continue to do so. A BBC survey of 17 EU member states found that the European public ranked Israel 4th to last, along with Iran and North Korea, as having a mainly negative impact on the world. Why has this campaign been so successful in Europe, this BDS campaign? And for that matter, why the rise of new anti-Semitism 70 years after World War II? Well, that's a speech unto itself. But there are a variety of factors. Memories of the Holocaust have faded. Politicians, and I'm one of them, react to numbers. There are 15 million Muslims in Europe. There'll be 30 million in 25 years. There are 1 million Jews in Europe. You make the equation in terms of voting. One engine is also the impasse in the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. It's very important to talk about how to deal with this. And let me mention a number of strategies. The first is, it's very important, as some frankly do, to label every opposition to Israeli politics as being anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist. We can't let that happen, or it stills legitimate criticism. Israel's a sovereign state. And part of being a sovereign state is subjecting yourself to criticism if people disagree with your policies. I mean, I disagree with the current president's policies. Doesn't make me anti-American. We have to separate it out. And how do we do it? Natan Sharansky, the former prisoner of conscience and the immediate past president of the Jewish Agency, had what he calls the 3 Ds policy to distinguish legitimate criticism for delegitimization. The first is Israel being demonized rather than simply criticized? Is there a double standard applied to Israel, as in the Human Rights Council in the UN? And is the critique against Israeli policy seeking to deny the legitimacy of Israel as opposed to changing its policies? Every charge made in this 3D category must be rebutted by irrefutable facts, and it is startling. I can't speak for those young people in Switzerland. I can tell you it is startling on American campuses how many young Jewish students don't know the most basic facts to refute these attacks. That in 1947, the United Nations created two states, an explicitly Jewish state and an Arab state. That Israel was willing to accept being a rump state territorially and was attacked instead by the United Armies of the Arab states. That Israel has indeed made great sacrifices for peace, withdrawing, for example, totally from the Egyptian Sinai, which President Carter was involved with, or unilaterally withdrawing from Gaza. 7,000 settlers were removed, unilaterally, by Sharon, Prime Minister Sharon, and left intact all the physical infrastructure, greenhouses and so forth, so that the Palestinians could take them over and have a livelihood. And instead, Hamas takes over, and instead of getting roses, Israel gets rockets. That's forgotten. It's forgotten. It's forgotten that two Israeli prime ministers, Prime Minister Olmert during the Clinton administration, in which I served in 2000 at the second Camp David, offered 95% of the West Bank back for a Palestinian state, offered East Jerusalem as a capital, offered 50,000 Palestinians to come back for family reunions, rejected by Arafat. And 8 years later, Prime Minister Olmert, 96% of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and 50,000, rejected by the current president of the Palestinian Authority, Mohammed Abbas, Abu Mazen. If we don't have those basic facts, how can we possibly defend this BDS effort? Again, and I say that being critical of Israel's settlement policy itself. And I say it to you now, and I say it to the Prime Minister, and I say it in Israel, that that settlement policy complicates our ability to attack the BDS movement and allows opponents of Israel to portray Israel as against the human rights of Palestinians. Now, I want to conclude by talking about broader global forces impacting all of us in the Jewish world. One is the historic shift of power and influence from the West in general, the United States, Europe, Switzerland, which have shared values and sizable Jewish communities, to those countries of the East and Asia and the South, which have a very different set of values and interests and almost non-existent Jewish communities. Israel recognizes this shift and as reliant as it is on the United States. Do you know that the third largest purchaser of Israeli military arms from India is Israel? Do you know that one of the largest and most growing trade relations is between China and Israel? So Israel understands this shift is occurring and is trying to develop ties with the emerging countries in Asia. Another phenomenon with which we must deal is globalization itself, that Herbert eloquently mentioned in his introduction. What do we mean by globalization? It's an easy word. It means the increased integration of countries, the increased self-dependence. So I'll give you an example. I'm probably the last person standing to use a BlackBerry. So I'll take that out and my iPhone to show you that I'm still in the 21st century. Everybody says that the iPhone is China's. No. 10% of the value of this phone is made in China. It's assembled in China from components with 7 different countries. We have supply chains that stretch across the world. We're mutually dependent. No iPhone if these other 6 countries don't cooperate. And that's a good thing. It makes the world more interdependent on peaceful relations. It's unthinkable that China and the United States could go to war because they would be shooting each other in the foot. Globalization means the ability to travel. It means the increased cultural interactions, and that's a good thing. Now, there are negative impacts, and that's one of the things that's caused us a problem. We're in what could be called the digital revolution, the mobile revolution, that your children and grandchildren understand a lot better than I do. If you're like me, when I have a computer problem, I call my grandchild. It's in their DNA now. But as wonderful as it is to be able to send an email from Washington, as I've done to Herbert in preparing for this talk, to Switzerland, and have it received instantaneously rather than, as my kids call it, snail mail. The digital revolution can also and is being misused in dangerous ways. Cyber attacks, which can disable entire societies. The lights, the water, everything we depend on is based on computerized systems. The use of the internet by terrorist groups to recruit and to have anti-Semitic literature, even on Facebook. The ability of the Russians to disrupt our own presidential election, which 17 intelligence agencies unanimously said they did in 2016 on behalf of the president. All of these things and many more, including China's theft of our major companies' intellectual property, are misuses of globalization and of the digital revolution. And yet, I think still it's a positive, but it's had a political impact as well. And that is, it's one of the reasons for this growing populist, nationalist revolution that swept the United States, and Brexit, and Poland, and Hungary, and Slovakia, and Slovenia, and Italy, and Brazil, because it's caused fear on the part of people who can't keep up with the rapidity of change, who see their jobs at risk, who see immigrants coming across borders. 1 million in Germany itself in 2015, ending what would have been an entirely successful third term for Merkel and having her hang on with her fingertips. Those of us who believe in globalization have an obligation to deal with the legitimate concerns of those who feel left behind, but to do it in ways that don't stoke fear, that don't stoke animosity, that don't stalk and encourage anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim activities. That's a tall order for us. But if we believe in globalization, we have an obligation to deal with the legitimate concerns of people, but in positive rather than negative ways. And the last global force is the challenge for the direction of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims. The outcome of this will speak volumes about the kind of world you and your children and your grandchildren will enjoy, and the state of Israel will experience as well. As I mentioned, I've spent an enormous amount of time in the Muslim world, and my belief is that the vast majority want their children to have a good education and a good job. They want empowerment. Women want to be part of societies. I would say to you that the real battle is not what a professor at Harvard, Sam Huntington, called the battle of civilizations between the West and the East. We shouldn't and must not look at it that way. The real battle is within the Muslim world, between fundamentalists and modernizers, between those who want to be part of the new globalized world and those who want to blow it up and create an Islamic caliphate. Those of us in the United States and Europe can help strengthen the forces of the moderates and those who want to be part of the modern world, and to isolate those who want instead to blow it up. I'm optimistic with all of this about the future of the Jewish community and the challenges we face in the 21st century. After all, let's look at where we are in 2019. We have come out of the ashes of the Holocaust. We've rebuilt a Jewish civilization in Europe. What's the fastest growing Jewish community in Europe? Germany. Germany. As Israelis and Soviet Jews and others come to Germany. We've produced, since World War II, since the Holocaust, a disproportionate number of Nobel Prize winners, of Pulitzer Prize winners, of Lasker Prize winners. We are now more integrated than ever in our society, so much so, and this is again another speech, that the real dangers in the diaspora are assimilation, losing our identity, not anti-Semitism. And yes, that talks about the West and what we've been able to accomplish after the Holocaust. Look at Israel, a high-tech wonder, one of the strongest economies in the world, the fifth most powerful military in the world, with a population of 8 million. Israel has created and fulfilled the prophetic vision of Jeremiah after the destruction of the first temple, in which he envisioned a great company, in his words, returning, children and wives with children. And we've done that now in the 20th and 21st century. We've been able to thrive in the diaspora and in Israel. We may be reduced in our number since 1939, but we've not been reduced in our impact. And if we can keep our Jewish identity up, we never will. Thank you very much.
You take the mic? Okay, thank you very much for coming here. It's a great privilege to meet you. I followed your distinguished career over a lot of many years. You have been called by The Economist the national treasure, and I think you are a national treasure. Where do we start? I think we start with the United States. On the 29th, there was supposed to be the State of the Union. Nancy Pelosi canceled it. So I ask you, what is the State of the Union of the United States on a scale from 1 to 10?
It's not at all where it should be, and it's very discouraging. I mean, I have been in Washington on and off since 1967. I have never seen such a polarized environment, Republicans and Democrats. The President of the United States, and I've had many disagreements with Republican and Democratic presidents, has acted in ways that are very different in terms of his whole respect for international agreements and politics. Ronald Reagan, who was the father of modern conservatism, reached major agreements with Democrats on the budget, on arms control issues, on tax. That's non-existent. You mentioned The Economist. I was interviewed way before Trump, 15 years ago. And I was asked for a cover story they were doing on American democracy, what I thought the major problem was with American democracy. And I said then, and it's been reinforced now, it was the collapse of the middle. And the Democratic Party going to the left, the Republican Party going to the right, and in our particular system of government, with its constitutionally divided government between a president and the legislative branch, the Congress, you've got to have a middle that's willing to cross party lines on key issues, and that's evaporated. So we get this polarization in which Trump makes statements. He rejected a bipartisan agreement to keep the government open and insists on building the wall. Pelosi has her thing, and we get into this tit for tat, and there are no people in the middle willing to bring the parties together to do it. So it's a very sad state, frankly. It's an unacceptable state. And here we are in competition with the Chinese for dominance in the 21st century. The Russians are the Russians. They're going to always be Russians, It's a petro state. Putin plays a bad hand very well. The Chinese are a different story. They're talking about 1.25 billion people, highly educated, perhaps by stealing our technology, highly technologically developed, but autocratic. They make a decision. President Xi pushes a button, and he makes a decision. And we've got to be able to show to the world that the future of the 21st century isn't with autocrats. It's with democracy. And if our own democracy is dysfunctional, how can we set an example? So I'm pained by this, very pained.
A few weeks ago, I was interviewing the former German Foreign Secretary Joschka Fischer from the Green Party, and he said they were always critical of America, but they could never imagine that America, the United States, would leave NATO, the North Atlantic Alliance, and now Trump is talking about it, thinking about it. Could you have imagined in your time working for 4 presidents that the United States would ever doubt their membership in NATO?
No, I mean, we're not going to leave NATO. But the fact is, in talking about saying that the Europeans are not paying their part, they're not, and we've said that for years, but that failing to recognize that NATO is important to American security, not just to European security. Even talking about it creates a problem. Talking about the European Union as our quote-unquote enemy, created as a way of competing with us. I mean, I was ambassador to the EU. I believe me, had plenty of disagreements with the European Union on trade issues and so forth, but the European Union states share our values of democracy and tolerance. Whatever one thinks about the Iranian nuclear deal, what we call the JCPOA, the Iranians would never have come to the table if the European Union hadn't joined us in sanctions, by cutting off the central bank, the SWIFT transaction, so forth. The European Union, they are our allies. Of course we have trade disagreements. So here is an administration, it's never been done before, that has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement, that has withdrawn, and it's about to withdraw from the intermediate nuclear agreement with Russia, negotiated, by the way, by Ronald Reagan, that has withdrawn from one international agreement after another, in part because they were done in the Obama administration. Contrast that again with Ronald Reagan. I mentioned in my book on President Carter, we negotiated what was called the SALT II nuclear arms reduction agreement with the Soviets. It was never ratified by the Senate for a whole variety of reasons. But for the full term, 7 years of that treaty, Reagan honored it because a previous president had negotiated. That sort of continuity has been lost, and it's very troubling.
Reading your book about Carter, Camp David plays a very central role, a major role. I mean, this contract between Israel, this treaty between Israel and Egypt, the two major powers in the Middle East, military powers, is now 40 years old. But you describe there the personalities. One side, Begin, who was very harsh, very withdrawn. On the other side, Anwar al-Sadat, who was outgoing. Jimmy Carter, who tried to be an honest broker. How do these personal relationships play a role in structuring a deal or a breakup of a deal?
I'll talk about this, and I'll just say that, you know, global politics depends on a lot of things. The economic power of countries, and here the United States remains dominant, but it also depends on personalities, the ability of a president to be able to negotiate. So let me take you into the picture as I describe it in the book. Just after Shabbat, on a Saturday night, a gleaming white Boeing 707 airplane descends from Cairo into Ben Gurion Airport with the symbol Arab Republic of Egypt on it. Takes the Israelis totally by surprise. The Israelis are very tough and hardened from wars. They lay out a red carpet very quickly. Sadat comes down with his very military erect posture. Generals are crying. Golda Meir says to Yitzhak Rabin, why didn't he come a few years earlier before the Yom Kippur War of 73 and save all our kids' lives on both sides? And as he comes to see Golda, she says, President Sadat, I've been waiting for a long time to see you. And he said, yes, and I'm here in peace, shalom. But he pledges in Israel no more wars after there were 5 between Egypt and Israel between 1948 and the Yom Kippur War of 73. Months go by to try to put something concrete around Sadat's pledge of no more wars. What does that mean? And the Israelis and the Palestinians can't negotiate it themselves. So here President Carter decides on a move of near desperation, afraid that historic trip by Sadat will go down in flames, and he invites him to the presidential retreat at Camp David, about an hour and a half out of Washington. No press allowed. And for 13 agonizing days and nights, he negotiates separately with Sadat and his Egyptian delegation and Prime Minister Begin and his Israeli delegation. Why? Because we put them together the first day, and it was like 2 scorpions in a bottle. And then Carter throws in 2 personal issues, and this gets to your point that it's not just policy, it's personality. For example, Reagan and Gorbachev had an incredible relationship. So Carter does 2 personal things. The first is on the first Sunday of the 13 days, he takes them in his presidential limousine, Begin on his left, Sadat on his right, to the famous Civil War battlefield at Gettysburg, where the decisive battle of the American Civil War is fought, to show them symbolically that 5 wars are enough. And Sadat, who was a general and who actually had trained at military academies in the United States, starts talking about all the mistakes the Confederate soldiers made, a little uncomfortable for Carter as a Southerner. Sadat, who's not a military man, but was a student of Abraham Lincoln, on the spot at Gettysburg, without a note, delivers Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. Really dramatic. Okay, all of that occurs. We're now on the 13th day, no peace. Close, but not there. And Begin says to Carter, Mr. President, I'm out of here. I can't and won't make any more compromise. He secretly told us it was like a glorified concentration camp. He says, I've already ordered a El Al plane at Andrews Air Force Base to take me back, get me a White House limousine, I'm out of here. Carter, realizing that Sadat's whole trip would go down, that it would encourage the radicals like Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, Syria, who were against Camp David and peace to begin with. And he takes a personal item, knowing from research that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren, and he gets a photograph made of the 3 of them, Begin, Sadat, and Carter, at the opening of the 13 days. He gets 8 copies made, autographs by name, each of Begin's grandchildren, walks them over to Begin's cabin, hands them the photographs with best wishes by their name for peace, Jimmy Carter, and sees Begin's lips begin to quiver and his eyes tear. He puts his bags down. He says, Mr. President, I'll make one last try, and the rest is history, 40 years later.
I asked this question because later Carter was very critical of Israel. And I wonder, since you were there, these different experiences he had with Sadat and Begin, and even before with the Rabin, who also was very remote, he was aloof, he didn't have this personal approach that Sadat had. Was that playing a role in Carter's decision to field with the Arabs more than with Israel?
So one of the most painful things in our relationship to this day, and he's now 94, and we are in very, very regular contact, is a book he wrote 30 years after he left office called Apartheid or Peace, using the apartheid word. And when I heard about this in an interesting way, I was at a conference at Hofstra University in New York, and on the panel was Erwin Kotler, who was then the Minister of Justice of Canada, very much Jewish, and Alan Dershowitz, who was my professor at Harvard. And Alan says to me, Stu, before we go on, I have to ask you a personal question. New York Times wants me to review your former boss's new book. And I said, what new book? He said, you don't know about the book? I didn't even know it. None of his aides knew it. He gave the title himself. And I was horrified. I sent him a memo. I said, whatever you think about the settlement policy, and I don't like it, it's not apartheid. You're associating yourself with the worst anti-Zionists. Gave him a whole list of reasons. I called up and urged him not to do it. He said, I wish I'd talked to you earlier. It's too late. The books are on the way to the book. But why did that come out? I think for a couple of reasons. The first is, here's a president who I mentioned at the beginning, did an enormous amount for Israel, for the Jewish people, the Holocaust Museum, the anti-boycott laws, and so forth. He gets the lowest percentage of Jewish votes of any Democratic president in modern history. But second was an incident. I was in the Oval Office in the White House with him. So at Camp David, in the last minute, Begin insisted that as a condition of signing the Camp David Accords, that Carter would, throughout the balance of his presidency, oppose any UN resolution that had Jerusalem mentioned as occupied territory, and he pledged that for the balance of the negotiations between Israel and Egypt, there would be no new settlement activity. Now the language, everybody was dead tired, it was the 13th day. It said during the balance of negotiations, Camp David was a framework, it wasn't a binding treaty. And in Camp David for 3 months, They would be getting a treaty together. The missing element, and this is part of Carter's book, the missing element of Camp David was the Palestinians. There were no Palestinians at Camp David because they were then represented by the PLO, which was considered a terrorist group. And so, at the Camp David Accords, 5 years would be given to negotiate, quote unquote, what Begin agreed to, full autonomy for the Palestinians.
Which was never implemented.
Never implemented. Okay, so I'm in the Oval Office, 3 months have passed. Begin announces the beginning of new settlements. And Carter said, he misled me. He said, 5 years. I said, wait a minute. I said, Begin, whatever you think about it, settlement policy is an honest person. He meant 3 months, the period between Egypt and Israel for the treaty, not 5 years. He could never have meant 5 years. His coalition would have collapsed. No, he took his notes out. I've got it right here. Now, the fact is the Israeli delegation had 3 months. Sadat announced Alexandria, 3 months. But that was something that really bothered him. And last, and most important, and this explains a lot of the anti-Israel settlement sentiment on college campuses and among the sort of left. And that is, Carter told me in one of the interviews for my book, and I'm quoting him now, not my view, that Carter says the Palestinians remind me of the blacks of the South when I grew up. And the Israeli military, he says, treat the Palestinians worse than the white treated the blacks. He sees this issue in civil rights terms, in human rights terms, rather than in security. So that's, I think, a lot of the reason for that sentiment.
Okay, Carter was the most critical president of Israel later when he wasn't president anymore. Trump is the most friendly president. If you look back the last few presidents, is that good for the Jews and good for Israel? What do you think?
It's good for Israel up to a point. It's good for Israel in terms of defending Israel in an unqualified way in the United Nations when it's attacked. It's a good thing in terms of providing the kind of military and economic assistance, although other presidents did the same thing. It's a good thing in knowing that you have a president who in an unqualified way will support you. But what was shown at Camp David, what was shown at the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, is that Israel also needs to be pushed and encouraged for peace.
This didn't happen when they moved the embassy.
And you also have to have the trust of the other side. The United States has to be, as they were with the Jordan-Israel treaty and the Egypt-Israel treaty, they have to be a trusted interlocutor. Yes, everyone knows we are Israel's great friend, and Trump has proven that. But because of that, the leverage he could have had if he said, look, I'm going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, it's the right thing to do. And it is the right thing. But I'm going to say to the Palestinians to keep their trust that I hope one day we'll have a two-state solution and an embassy in East Jerusalem. That's not done. And then cutting the aid for the Palestinians doesn't help Israel because Israel needs the Palestinians for intelligence sharing against Hamas in the West Bank. So, in my opinion, Israel is benefited by a president who supports a two-state solution, who supports a democratic majority Jewish state. And I can tell you, I go to Israel 2-3 times a year. I've gone probably 50 times. I chair with Dennis Ross, the Jewish People's Policy Institute, the think tank. Sentiment in Israel has dramatically changed. The Likud party, which is Bibi Netanyahu's own party, has officially withdrawn its support for a two-state solution. If there's a sentiment now, it's for a one-state solution. What does a one-state solution mean? What are you going to do with 2.5 million Palestinians? You can give them voting rights. If you don't give them voting rights, what do you give them? I mean, and all the time since the '67 war, even with Begin, even with Sharon, even with Shamir, conservatives as well as with Rabin and Peres, Israel's never annexed the West Bank. They've never said, this is ours, we're going to apply Israeli law to it. Now, they may be creeping annexation, but now the sentiment in Israel is to go the whole way.
And what should America do about it?
I mean,
they sent Jared Kushner there.
I mean, there comes some point at which the United States has to say, this isn't in Israel's best interest. Will that happen? I don't know. I mean, thus far, there's no prime minister who's declared a one-state solution. But what I'm telling you is sentiment in Israel, including the prime minister's own party, is for a one-state solution. And the United States has to say clearly and simply, we are supporters of Israel. We want Israel secure. We will do everything to help Israel's security. And I want to get to one point on that as well, on Syria. But it's not in your interest to have absolute control over 2.5 million Palestinians. All right, now let's take Syria, which is one place where, again, I think the president's policies are not productive. I can't tell you as strongly as I would like that the Syrian civil war has been catastrophic in two ways. Ways number one is you in Europe. Where did all these refugees come from? It's because of the Syrian civil war. And second, filling in this chaos in Syria, the Russians now have a port in Syria with their warships, which they didn't before. And Iran has established through their so-called Al-Quds force, the elite of the Revolutionary Guard, a permanent military presence there. And they're building military facilities for missiles. That's unacceptable. I mean, if there's going to be a war between Israel and Iran, it won't be in Tehran. It will be in Syria. Israel has dozens of times bombed convoys going from Iran through Iraq and Lebanon into Syria. This missile facility cannot be allowed. And by the U.S. withdrawing, as the president just said, our troops there, we lose the leverage, and we have our Syrian Kurd allies at great threat. One other point to make on Iran. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has 100,000, not 1,000, not 10,000, 100,000 missiles from Iran, increasingly precision missiles aimed at Israel. And you can have all the iron domes you want. When you have that many, it's very difficult to defend against. So we, the United States, have got to continue, as painful as it is, to be present in the Middle East.
But who lost the Middle East? Was it Obama when he said there is a red line and then he didn't follow through? Or was it Trump who said we defeated ISIS?
I call them like I see them, all right, Democrat or Republican. I was very, and I am very critical of Obama for twice establishing a red line on chemical weapons. And then as our airplanes and the French Mirage planes are ready for a joint effort against Syria to pull it back, that showed an inconstancy. So yes, absolutely that, the fact that there was a surge, but a surge of U.S. troops only for a defined period of time. I mean, if I tell you as my enemy, I'm coming in, but don't worry, in 12 months I'll be gone. I mean, what kind of a deterrent is that? So yes, I mean, I think he can very much be criticized, and I have been criticized.
Okay, let's change the topic a bit. You talked about anti-Semitism, about criticism of Israel. Then you said we have to fight this with irrefutable facts. Are there any irrefutable facts nowadays that are respected in a day of, or in an age of fake news, enemy of the people, lying president? Everything is refuted on a daily basis.
Well, one of the problems with social media and with the press is that it's difficult to establish what is fact from fiction. And anybody can post something on the internet and even say that it's from the Washington Post when it's not. So this is a great challenge. You're a journalist. It requires respected institutions, your paper, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, which are still respected, to be able to get the truth out. And this is very important. Now, one of the things we talked about for your first question about the state of American democracy is the press. When I was growing up, when Marion Hein Lewin was growing up, you had three major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. And the people who broadcast, like Walter Cronkite, David Brinkley, when they said a fact was a fact was a fact. Now, we have a proliferation of cable networks, and the right listens to Fox News, and the left listens to MSNBC, and people are posting everything on social media, so it is extremely difficult to get facts out, and we have to be as sophisticated as our opponents are in getting the correct facts.
Okay, now what do you think is going to happen in the United States? I mean, people are talking about impeachment. The Mueller report is coming out soon, probably. The Democrats are in charge of the House. There is this situation where a fourth of the government is on shutdown, no end in sight. What is your reading of this whole situation?
Well, first of all, I mean, no one can predict what the Mueller report is going to say. This was a report investigating Russian
What do you
interference.
expect?
So I'll give you a personal example. January of 2017, after the November 2016 election, 17 intelligence agencies of the United States, 17, unanimously conclude the Russians interfered in our elections by hacking, and second, that they did so on behalf of Trump. What Mueller is looking at is
on behalf of Putin, right?
On behalf of Trump. The Russians were doing so.
The Russians were doing it on behalf of Trump, right?
And what Mueller is looking at is whether or not the Trump campaign actively collaborated. But the first two facts are irrefutable. Okay, now, personal example. About 4 weeks before the November 2016 election, I get an email from a friend in Israel saying, you're on the front page of Jerusalem Post and Haaretz, because I was advising Hillary on Middle East and Iran issues, and I sent memos in. And when they hacked into the campaign chairman of Hillary, they got my emails and gave it to WikiLeaks and then to Haaretz. And there was nothing embarrassing in them, but they got them. Okay, so then, 4 weeks after the election, 2 FBI agents come to my office, my law office in Washington. Just think, Herbert, if you had 2 FBI agents in your office, and they show me their badges and so forth, and I said, oh God, what did I do? And they said, you know what happened to your emails that you sent to the campaign? We have now found, as part of our Russia investigation, that your personal computer was targeted by the Russians with fake Google alerts, which thankfully I didn't look into, but it just shows a dimension of what the Russians were trying to do. Now, no one knows what Mueller's going to find, and I can't predict. I mean, he's run a very professional operation. I really hope that there's nothing impeachable in it, because I think the worst thing for our already divided country would be another impeachment. I really pray that that doesn't happen. Hearings, censures, whatever, but not this, because that's the ultimate weapon. When the Republicans in the House tried to use it against Bill Clinton because of the Monica Lewinsky thing, they lost badly in the next election. So I hope Democrats realize that and control their emotions, regardless of what Mueller says, unless there's some extraordinary finding, which I would doubt.
You have observed presidents, many presidents from very close. What did you think when you saw Putin and Trump in Helsinki, how he behaved?
Well,
People thought he played him like a fiddle. Did you think so also?
What's very strange, and it sort of plays into this whole issue of Russian interference, Trump, is that Trump criticizes the European Union. He calls Prime Minister Trudeau from Canada weak and dishonest. He criticizes Merkel. He criticizes Prime Minister May. He doesn't criticize Putin, quite the contrary. And now we found out last week that when Putin met with the president in Helsinki, and it was one-on-one with only the translator's notes. Trump took the translator's notes. I mean.
So, would you say? What could be the reason for that?
It was required a movie producer to say that, and I'm not a movie producer. I can only tell you that's a fact. I mean, it's a really strange fact. It's an unprecedented fact. Why would he do that? What was said in that you wouldn't want your own cabinet to know? Again, we'll see shortly, but I really hope we don't go down this impeachment route. It would be extremely divisive in a country that is enormously parallel.
Okay, thank you very much. Just one more question. You apologize for calling Switzerland responsible for prolonging World War II because of these deals with the Nazi gold and the Swiss National Bank. You're a very meticulous person. And I wonder, why did this mistake happen? Was it in order to put more pressure on the Swiss government?
No. So I headed an interagency study of Switzerland during the war with 13 agencies. And my chief right-hand person was the State Department's historian, non-political person, William Slaney, since deceased, but a wonderful person and a great historian. By the way, the State Department is the only department that has its own historian. So as we were compiling all of the facts, I asked him, I said, Bill, did the actions prolong the war? And he said, probably. Now, I should have stuck with the facts and let the facts speak for themselves rather than trying to be someone who gave a global perspective and made that conclusion. But here's the fact. There are two basic things when it came to the Swiss bank issue. The first was, I'm sitting in my office in Brussels as ambassador to you, and I'm reading down the right column of the front page of the Wall Street Journal Europe in 1994, an article by a Wall Street Journal reporter named Brian Pomper saying that there are dormant Swiss bank accounts that were created by people, Jews, trying to protect, I should say, their money from the onrushing Wehrmacht and putting it in the safest banks in Europe, in neutral Switzerland. And, says the article, after the war, either the original owners or the heirs of those killed go to the banks. Herbert was involved in some of these cases himself as a lawyer, and say, do you have my parents or grandparents or aunt or account? No, we don't have any evidence. And the poster child in that article, and she's very much alive today in Boston, Greta Beer, went from bank to bank in the snows of Switzerland and finds nothing. Father's. So I called Washington, and I was already being asked to involve myself in Holocaust-related issues. And I said, can I go to Bern, Switzerland, and pursue this? So my staff was against my doing the whole Holocaust thing, because you have a full-time job as ambassador to you anyway. But he said, okay, go. So I go to Bern. I bring the article with me. And I said, is it true that there are these dormant Jewish bank accounts? Yes. We've put our own ombudsman on the trail. We've looked at every bank account of every Swiss bank, even those that don't exist anymore, between 1933 and 45. And we found 732 accounts. We've plussed up the interest over those years. We're going to give out $32 million to those account holders. Well, I said, maybe if they waited this long, that's not the full account. And I got Paul Volcker, who we and the Carter administration appointed as chairman of the Federal Reserve. He got 4 American accounting firms, which charged the Swiss banks $200 million in audit fees, and found 54,000 accounts possible and 21,000 certain. We created a claims process. Now, that didn't have anything to do with the war being longer or shorter. But what we found in our report is the following. When the Germans occupied countries, they stole the gold bullion in the treasuries were central banks of those countries. The Reichsmark, which was the paper currency of Nazi Germany, was worthless as a matter of international exchange because we put a boycott on it, sanctions on it. So what the Germans did is they took this gold bullion and they also took fake gold bullion made of gold fillings and watches and jewelry of Jews, smelted down and made it look like gold bullion, and they gave it to the central bank of Switzerland, not the private bank. And the central bank converted those gold bullion into Swiss francs, which were convertible to buy. Okay, now, we also showed that the Swiss bank, and this was reaffirmed by your own Bergier report, knew exactly what the deposits were in the Swiss and the German central bank, and knew that they were going way over that and must have therefore come and didn't do anything. So I should have stuck with the facts and not tried to make conclusions. The facts will speak for themselves.
Okay, and in the last few years, you had only praise for Switzerland and...
Yes, I have praise for Switzerland for a number of reasons. The first is, I think Switzerland has very much come to its terms. I mean, after all, for over 50 years before I got involved, Switzerland's image of itself, what it was teaching its school children, was we were studiously neutral. And in fact, your country, on a proportionate basis, took more Jewish refugees than the United States.
Democratic President FDR,
yeah.
He didn't do a great job, huh?
Canada, there's a book called 9 is Enough, 9 refugees in Canada. So you had about 20,000, 25,000. The borders closed pretty much in 42, but still. So I think you've very much come to terms with the past. I mentioned that as chair of the International Holocaust Task Force, you've done a very good job. The Bergier report is very good. And so I think Switzerland's come to a recognition that you weren't pro-Nazi, no, but that it was a much more nuanced situation. And after all, you were right on the thumb. Let me mention one other thing to close, because it shows so much of the mindset. In 1938, the famous USS St. Louis departs a ship with Jewish refugees from Hamburg to the United States, but it's going to Cuba. That was the deal. And there had been many other boats allowed in Cuba, and frankly, the Jewish agency was paying off the dictator of Cuba. And suddenly, the St. Louis comes there, and Cuba won't allow them in. And negotiations, and no one is still sure why. So the boat turns around and goes to Miami. And it sits outside the harbor of Miami for 3 days trying to get clearance. I know this for a fact because I know his son, and I saw the transcript. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Secretary of the Treasury, calls Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, and begs him to allow in the refugees. Hull refuses. He even suggests taking him to the U.S. Virgin Islands. Hull refuses. So what happens to the St. Louis? Well, everybody thinks everybody died. No. They go back to go back to Europe, not to Germany, and 4 countries who were much closer to the thumb of Hitler than we were agree to take 25%, each 25%. The UK, all the people who were lucky enough to go to the UK survived. France, 75% roughly survived. Belgium, 25% survived. The Netherlands, where Marion was born, 5%. But the point is, they were willing to do more than we were. Why? Why? So this has haunted me for a number of years, and is why I got into this Holocaust. So put yourself in my position. I'm 25 years old. I finished a year in the White House with Johnson. I'm working with Hubert Humphrey's campaign against Nixon. And one of my co-workers sitting as close to me as you are is a guy named Arthur Morse, who had just published a book called While 6 Million Died. And for the first time using declassified documents, Roosevelt didn't confiscate his translator's notes. It showed what Roosevelt and his administration knew about the genocide of Jews and refused to. Well, I was shocked because Roosevelt was like a hero in our house. I joke that Jews at the time believed in three things: Die Welt, this world; Jene Welt, the world to come; and Roosevelt. And here was a shock. Here's this icon. And I said to myself, literally then, if I ever have a chance to rectify this cloud, I'm going to do it. That's what led me to encourage Carter to do the Holocaust Museum. That's why I've done all this work, because I believe we have a cloud to clear up.
You have done great things. Thank you for everything you did, and you wrote a great book. Congratulations.
So, thank you very much. Those of you, again, can't get the book in the back. I think there's some raffle or something. You can get it on Amazon. Give me your name, and I'll send book plates that you can put into the book personalized. Thank you again for ICZ.
Thank you.
Herbert, this says made in California. I don't understand.
Not quite, not yet.
Better than China, better than China. Dear Stuart, I'm speechless. Thank you very, very much for all the insights you gave us, your inspiring speech. I think we heard a lot here, which we all were not aware of. And I think your way of putting together in perspective the world, the US, is really